Who is the real Jesus anyway? That's what we've been talking about. Welcome to 3D Church. Those that are guests here, my name is Jared, and thank you so much for joining us online. So glad that you guys are here as well. And if you are a guest here, go out and meet Ryan. I mean, who wouldn't want to meet a British guy anyway? Did I get it? Am I close? He gave me the thumbs up, so I must have some British in me. His wife said no. I'll work on that. Well, we are in this series called The Real Jesus, and we're talking about how many people that we know have an inaccurate idea or perception of who Jesus is. And, I told you a couple weeks ago when I was here that this series kind of birthed in my heart about a conversation I had with a friend of mine online, not a believer, family's not a believer. He was open, but family members of his were not. And just kind of like, well, why? Like, why are they not engaged? And really, we kind of agreed that it was due to probably a misrepresentation of who Jesus is, probably by another believer or two or something down the line where it got this person to say, I'm out. I don't want to have anything to do with that. So we talked about that, but I mean, we talked if people really knew who the real Jesus actually was, we're confident that you couldn't keep people away from him. But the problem is that there's misperceptions and misunderstandings of who he is. And so what we want to do the next couple weeks here is try to reveal just some more of the true nature of who he is, the true characteristics of Jesus. And not that you don't know that as a believer. Sometimes it's hard to articulate that. We want to bring that out so you can take that into your worlds. And I believe that people are going to come to know Jesus because of it. So this week we're talking about Jesus and religion. Jesus and religion. And because I think there's a lot of people associate Jesus with religion. And I don't know why. Honestly, I don't know why. You have, for some reason, people put Jesus and religion in the same camp. And the question is, well, why? Was Jesus religious? Did he live like a religious life? Is that why people think, well, Jesus and religion go together? Or maybe it's less about Jesus and more about us. Do we as followers embody religion? Do we carry it around with us? Do people look on and say, well, he must be religious, therefore, oh, wow, that kind of fits the stereotype, Jesus and religion. I don't know why, but people do. People all over, churched or unchurched, okay? We have mixed feelings about religion. How do you guys know? It's a hot topic. It always has been. It always will be. And everyone, whether you're from the church or not, have mixed feelings about religion. And the question I want to address today is this. What did Jesus think about religion? Have you ever wondered that? I mean, we think about it, but did Jesus think about it? And if you did, what was it? What was his perception? What was his idea? What were his reactions to religion? And I know if people really, if they knew what he thought about religion, would that change what they think about him? That's another question I have. So the Gospels are actually, I don't know if you know this or not, they're full of Jesus' response and thoughts about religion. Did you know that? Sometimes you got to read between the lines. When you go through it, I challenge you, read through the Gospels. And anytime the Pharisees come on the scene or religion comes on the scene, watch Jesus' actions. What does he say? What does he do? That reveals a lot of his character and his nature. And we're going to talk about that. So before we do this, I want to just ask you the question, what comes to your mind when you think about religion? What feelings do you have? What associations are there when you just hear the word religion? Maybe you grew up in religion and maybe it brings some of that back. Maybe there's people that come to your mind. What associations are they positive or are they negative? I think we all have different perceptions of religion. And I don't know why. I laugh. I really don't know why this is, but I'm going to show you. This is my perception of religion. I don't know why. I'm going to throw a slide on there so you can see it. I'm serious. I don't understand it. I don't know why. Maybe it's because I'm an immature adult male and I like the movie. I don't know why this comes to my mind. I just don't. It's just when I think of religion, I think of Nacho Libre. I don't know why. But what I do know is that seeing the movie only about 100 times, I just know that there's this theme that runs through this movie. It's about a guy who's a friar and he lives in a monastery and, he wants to be a wrestler. He's always wanted to be a wrestler, but that's sin. It's sinful, and it's always been taught as sin. And so the people he's with, you can't do that or whatever. It's wrong. And so he kind of has this way of trying to get out of that. He ends up becoming a wrestler and sort of breaking the chains of religion there. But I don't know why. When I think of this, though, it reminds me of how many people actually, they work so hard all their lives to sort of gain God's blessings. It's so hard, like their whole lives. In other words, they spend most of their lives trying to gain God's favor. And ultimately, when it's all stripped away, that's what religion is. I love, Ryan said it, I have this in my notes. Religion at its core is man's attempt to get to God. It's man's attempt to get to God. It's man trying to earn enough favor to get up to a worthy enough position by what we do or what we say and how we live our lives. Okay? And understand here, I'm not saying that living well and doing good is wrong. That's very good. Okay? Living well, and that's great. In fact, living right in the context of our faith, if not out of obligation, that's actually an overflow of grace. Did you know that? Living well and doing well, okay, if not out of an obligation, it's actually just grace pouring back out of us that was poured into us. That's what that is. So I'm not saying that living well and doing good is wrong, but if our position with God is a measure of how hard we work, we are now living from a position of religion. And the opposite of that would be living from a position of grace. And we're going to talk about both of those here in a few minutes. What is the difference between living from a position of religion and living from a position of grace? I think one of the problems of living from a position of religion is if we're not careful, it can start to pour out of our lives in the form of what we call legalism. Or law. Some people say law, right? If we're not careful, okay? There's probably people that believe in religion that are religious and they don't have that, but it can easily come out of us if we're steeped into religion, that legalism starts to come out, and when we're not careful, it actually will come out on other people. And I'm confident that attitude and those perceptions, and when that comes out, that's why people say, I don't want to have anything to do with the church. I don't want to know Jesus. I don't want to know the Bible. Because they walked into a position, I said this a couple weeks ago, where before they met the real Jesus, they met real legalism is what they met. And that kept them from coming in the doors. And so that's the danger. But if we live from a position of grace, we're actually free. Get this. We're actually free to step out of religion, to step out of legalism, and actually we're free to extend it to others. And we're going to talk about that too. I saw a tweet, and Ryan said this earlier, and this is by a guy. Now, either you love him or you hate him. And he knows this. We know this. Pastor Mark Driscoll, I happen to love him. I love what he has to say. I know that there are some struggles there, but I love what he has to say in this quote. It says, religion is man's pursuit of God. Christianity is God's pursuit of man. And I love that so, and Ryan said it so well too, and he gets that out of the text, 1 John chapter 4:10, when it says that, not that we love God, but God first loved us. That's kind of where that comes from, right? So, but it's interesting, because I look at this quote, and I see like one side of it, okay, one side of that quote, I don't know, I just picture a God sort of with his arms crossed like this, and he's kind of looking down on mankind with disdain, and man's working so hard to get to God and so hard to God, but it's never enough. Like there's so much more to do. There's such a high ladder I have to climb. How am I ever going to get there? And God is like this. On the other side of that quote, I picture a God of just uninhibited grace. Never-ending, passionate pursuit of us. And no matter what we do or how far we run, he's always there with his arms like this. Have you ever experienced a Jesus with his arms like this before? Where you're like, there's no way God could forgive me. And Jesus says, come on. I already did. What would our lives look like? What would our lives look like if we lived from a position of grace rather than a position of religion? And I don't know where you come from today. I don't know your background. I don't know if you came from, maybe you grew up in a religious home. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you came from a church background. Maybe you don't. I don't know where you're at. But what if? What if we lived from a position of grace? What would our lives look like? How would our interactions with people be? How would we view the real Jesus if we lived life from a position of grace? I told you guys that the Gospels were full of Jesus' attitudes and reflections and actions or reactions, rather, toward religion. I don't have time to go to all of them, but I do want to bring up one story that really just sort of hits home for me, and I love this story because I like Jesus' reaction here. And so, to sort of set it up, there's a group called the Pharisees, and we're going to talk about them in a second because you may not know who they are, but this group of Pharisees is coming to see Jesus. And very rarely, if you know anything about the Pharisees, very rarely did they ever come to Jesus to be taught. They never did. They either come to Jesus to try to impose some sort of religious demand, or they came to Jesus, really, to try to trap him, to try to mix him up in his words and try to manipulate him so that he would lie and they could kill him. Seriously, read through the Gospels. Every time they're trying to bait Jesus, and Jesus is like always just these amazing responses to the Pharisees that leave them just frustrated and they walk away. And so anyway, so these group of Pharisees are coming to see Jesus. It's probably a nice afternoon. They're hanging out. They come to see Jesus, and they notice that Jesus is having lunch with his disciples. And one leans over and says, "Hey, did you notice that the disciples, they didn't wash their hands before they ate?" "Yeah, I did notice that. That's against the law. They can't do that. So let's go do something about it." So they walk up to Jesus and they say this. Mark 7, verse 5 says, "So the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law asked him, 'Why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition?'" I love the word our. Our age-old tradition. "They ate without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." So it's not just washing the hands. There's actually a ceremony that goes along with washing your hands. So Jesus replied, "You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. For you ignore God's law and substitute your own tradition.'" Then Jesus called to the crowd to come here. He said, "All of you listen," he said, "and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you, but what comes out of your heart that defiles you." There were a few things in Jesus' ministry that frustrated him beyond measure, and the Pharisees were one of it. It's not that he didn't love the Pharisees, okay? But he's waving a white flag. He's like, "Hi, I'm God. And it's like they just don't see it. And there are a few things in his ministry that actually frustrated him. The Pharisees were one of them. You see, the Pharisees, if you don't know the background, the Pharisees were sort of like your religious elite. Okay, they were the guys that knew it all. They knew the Old Testament, the Old Testament law, the books of the law. They knew the rules, right? And they kept them. And they kept them so well that they began to impose them on other people. You see, they didn't encourage people to live religiously. They didn't encourage them. They demanded that they live religiously, just like them. Just like them. And they became so obsessed with following the rules that they forgot why the rules were there. They forgot about it. It was like the rules. And you sat back, why are we doing this? They didn't know that. And so in this case, the Pharisees came to Jesus complaining about traditions being violated. And the irony here is this. Those very same traditions were keeping them from God. Those very same traditions were violating their relationship with God. You see, the Pharisees were like, and Pastor Keith says this so well, they were like sin police, right? Okay, God, just in case, we know you're all powerful sometimes, just in case, if you need some help, we'll just make sure everybody's doing the right thing, right? And that's the trap. That's the trap of religion. If we're not careful, if we're steeped into religion, we can start managing other people's sins really quickly. And I'm not talking about like biblical accountability and biblical restoration when your brother's in a sin. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about walking around with a ruler and slapping hands whenever there's a sin that comes out. And Jesus said, "You are so preoccupied with your religious traditions, it's actually keeping you from the very God that you claim to worship." And he says, "It's not what comes into your mouth that makes you unclean, but what comes out of your heart." They honored God with their hearts, or with their words, but their hearts were far from them. And if you're like me, I ask the question, well, how in the world can a group of people or someone be so zealously following after God that they just miss him altogether? Like, how is that possible? I have this analogy I want to read to you guys, and I don't want to butcher it, so I just want to read it because it's so good. This, to me, explains why the Pharisees did what they did, okay? You got to understand, the Pharisees, it wasn't like they had bad intentions, okay? It wasn't that at all, but something got mixed along the way. Let me just give you an analogy, okay? Put yourself in this position. Imagine yourself moving into a mountain house with a huge picture window overlooking a lake with a grand view of beautiful snow-capped mountains. You have a front row seat before all of this beauty. The water, the rocks, the trees, wildflowers, the cloud formations, wild storms, and the entire spectrum of sun-illuminated colors. And it's all yours. At first, you're just captivated by the view. You sit and you stand and you look and you admire. You catch your breath at times. Several times a day, you actually interrupt your work just to stand before this window and take in the majesty. Then one day, you notice that there's some bird droppings on the glass. And you get your bucket of water and a towel and you clean it. A couple days later, a rainstorm leaves the window streaked and the bucket comes out again. One day, some visitors come over with a tribe full of small, dirty-fingered children. And the moment they leave, you notice there are smudge marks all over that window. They're hardly out the door before you have the bucket out again. You're so proud of this window. It's such a large window. But it's incredible how many different ways foreign objects can attach themselves to it. Obstructing the view, distracting from the vision. Keeping that window clean now becomes a compulsive neurosis. You accumulate ladders and buckets and squeegees. You construct scaffolding outside and in. You have to get all the difficult corners from top to bottom. You end up having the cleanest window in North America. And then you wake up one day. You've completely forgotten what's on the other side of that window because you realize it's been years since you actually looked through it. Now you are a Pharisee. Have you met a Christian that's so obsessed with doing the right thing that they forget why it is they're doing it in the first place? This is living from a position of religion. We're talking about Jesus and religion today, and there's a few things that I feel like we can draw out of this passage, this interaction that Jesus had with the Pharisees that I think sort of reveal a little bit of his heart into who he is and what he feels about religion. But before we do that, I just want to make sure that we don't confuse, because there may be people here that go, well, golly, I love God. I was raised in a religious home, and my parents were religious, and they loved God. And what's wrong with religion? With religion? And I want to just be clear with something. There's a difference between religion and passionate pursuit of Jesus. Okay, there's a big difference there. If we're not unapologetically following Jesus with all of our hearts, there's something wrong. And when we're unapologetically following Jesus, our actions are going to start aligning with what we believe. Does that make sense? The problem is when we become so obsessed with doing the right thing, we forget why they're doing them. And when we start to live for the rules rather than the one who created the rules, we've now steeped into religion. So, I got these in your notes. This is when we live from a position of religion. Number one, we take our eyes off of Jesus and put them on man-made ideas. Number one, we begin to take our eyes off of Jesus and put them on man-made ideas. Verse 7 and 8 said this: their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. You ignore God's law and you substitute your own tradition. Religion frustrates God because it takes our eyes off of him and puts them on a construct, okay? It puts them on a man-made creation, okay, called religion. And over time, religion becomes more about us than it does about God. Isn't that weird? Because a lot of people go, well, religion, it's all about God. It's not all about God. It's all about you and me. It becomes about you and me. Because our own sort of guidance and tradition starts steeping in. And I don't want to talk about examples. You know some examples. There are things that people say, hey, that's wrong. It's like, well, why is that wrong? The abuse of that might be wrong, but why is that wrong? What happens with religion is over time, it becomes about us. It becomes about what we think is right instead of what God says about what is right. And again, it's not that the heart of like, well, these people are bad. It's not about that, but it becomes about us. The Pharisees clung to man-made ideas, and they took their eyes off of God. What happened is they started substituting God's guidance with their own. Does that make sense? That's what they started doing. The second thing that I think Jesus feels about religion is this. Number two, when we're living from a position of religion, we begin to walk farther from God rather than closer. When we are in a position of religion, we work farther than God rather than closer. It says this in verse 6. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Just like anything, friends, just like anything else in our lives, religion can be an obstruction or a hindrance between us and God. It's that simple. And the last point here, and this is probably the most important because this is really going to flow into the rest of what we're talking about. When we live from a position of religion, number 3, we stop extending grace to others. We stop extending grace to others. This was the Pharisees' whole deal. This was their problem. Either live life by the rules or get the heck out. When we become steeped into religion, we become less compassionate, and the grace that was once extended to you and me stops being extended to other people. So here's the deal. We can either live from a position of religion, or we can live from a position of grace. I'm going to tell you one more story. I want to shift it because we saw this side of religion. Okay, great. That's sort of what Jesus thinks about religion. That's the problem with religion. Okay, and I say that, I really want to say that respectfully, okay? I really do. But Jesus' response tells me enough. Okay, so that's one side. The other side is, well, what about this side of grace? What about this side of living from a position of grace? I want to tell you a story. Now, this is so good, and I can't take credit for it. I wish I could, but I'm not this smart. How many know who Judah Smith is, Pastor Judah Smith? Yeah. Pastor Keith actually played a video last week at Easter, and he was sort of narrating that. But for whatever reason, God brought me to this message sometime the last week and a half, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good that I just have to share it. So if you say, hey, that was really good, it's not me, okay? Let's give credit where credit's due, okay? But let me just tell you this story. Some of you guys are familiar with this story. Jesus walking on the water. Anybody hear about that story before? Right? It's the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. So here's what happens, okay? Disciples are out on a boat. They're out doing their thing. The waves kind of get big or whatever. And then they see somebody walking on the water. And every single account that's written on this, everyone says that they thought they saw a ghost. I mean, these guys were freaking out, okay? They saw Jesus walking on the water. Like, is that a ghost? And Jesus said no, right? So Jesus goes, hey, Peter, come on out to me. Now, why he chose Peter, I don't know. Peter likely was probably the oldest one. He probably was should have been the most mature one. The least likely to make a mistake, maybe. But he says, Peter, come on out here, man, come on. And so Peter goes, oh gosh, here we go. That is Jesus, right? Not a ghost, right? So, steps out on the boat, right? Steps out of the boat. He starts walking on water as he's coming out to Jesus, right? Well, we know this story, right? He's kind of trucking along. Maybe the disciples are like, hey, you see that fish? Whatever. Freaks him out. He turns around. He starts getting scared because the waves start actually building up in the wind. And we know sort of the analogy. We all heard it, right? He took his eyes off of Jesus, and what happened? He began to sink, okay? So Jesus goes to Peter and he goes, it's all right, man, come on. He picks him up. He restores him, brings him back into the boat. And then this is what it says in Mark 14. It says, when they climbed back in the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. They just started worshiping him. Just immediately. The wind dies, the sun comes out, the birds chirp. Does anybody care that Peter almost died? I mean, they didn't even offer the guy a towel. The least they could have done is put their arms around the guy, throw him a towel and a cup of joe or something, And here's the point. Peter failed. He failed. And I know we've heard the story in the sermons, well, at least he was the only one that got out of the boat. He failed. And he failed miserably. And here's the point. Here's where I want to land this the next few minutes and take this thing. This is where I want to land it. all of us, you and me, standing right here in this room as witnesses to each other, all of us have at one time had to worship wet. You're like, well, what does that mean, worship wet? At one time or another, all of us, you and me, have failed, and failed miserably. We took our eyes off of Jesus and we what? We sank. And just like Peter, Jesus came, he picked us up, brought us back into his grace, and we had to worship wet. We had to worship as a failure. We had to worship as a screw-up, an embarrassment. And we had to be restored from wet to dry. Isn't that an amazing concept? Peter, in front of all of his friends, as embarrassing as that would have been, here's probably the oldest disciple, the most mature disciple, walks on the waters, doing great, and then he fails. He had to get back in the boat with all eyes on him, and he had to worship wet. But as amazing as this perspective on Peter is not the one I want to focus on for the next few minutes. He's not the character I want to focus on for the next few minutes. It's actually the other people inside that boat. I want to focus on the other people that witnessed this event, that saw Peter fail miserably, that saw Peter come back up. I want to talk about, for just a few minutes, the disciples. Sure, I was goofing around. They could have helped Peter. They probably did, right? They probably helped Peter. They probably threw a tunic on him, dried his hair. Who knows? They probably did. But here's the deal. Here's what I want us to get today. The disciples allowed the failure back in the boat. And they allowed Peter to worship wet. You see, it is really easy, Christians. It is really easy, followers of Jesus, for us to go, hey, bring all the wet from the community in. Bring them all in. Come on now, we got towels for you. Bring them all the broken, the needy, the unsaved, the unchurched. We want them in here. After all, Jesus said, go get them a towel, figuratively. But it is harder. It is harder to bring back in Christians that have sunk. It's harder to bring Christians that have sunk into pornography, that have sunk into drug addictions and alcoholism. It's harder to accept people that have had failed marriages and inappropriate relationships and gossip and backstabbing and hatefulness. And it's harder, especially if it's you that was hurt in the process. Don't believe me? Think about it. Think about that one unforgivable in your life. And that one unforgivable, turn around, look back there. That's the door they're standing in right there. They're walking in and they're soaking wet. And don't tell me for 1 second you don't go, why is that person here? Why is she here? What about Christians that have hurt you? What about Christians that have stabbed you in the back, that have lied to you, that have lied about your families, that have denounced your name and your kids? And they're coming in here and they're standing back there and they're soaking wet. And they know it. We have to allow, Christians, hear me, we have to allow people to worship wet. Even if they're wet because of something they did to you. That, my friends, right there, is living from a position of grace. I'm going to ask the band to come up right now. I have a few more things I want you guys to do, and I'm sorry this is awkward. They're going to come up here right now. I'm going to kill time, maybe dance for you guys a little bit. But I want them to come up here and sort of, they're going to lead us into some worship here in a few minutes, and I just want us to allow that space and that time for them to come up here. But there's two things that I want you guys to understand. And there's two things I want you guys to grasp about today. If you leave here knowing nothing else, okay, this is the two things I want you to do. And write these down. They're in their notes, okay? They're in your notes. When we live from a position of grace, and ladies, would you leave this up for just a little bit? Because I'm going to go through it fast. I want them to just write this down. When we live from a position of grace, number one, we let people back in the boat. We let people back in the boat, and we give them a towel. We give them a towel. The beautiful thing about grace is it's not religion. Did you hear me? The beautiful thing about grace is it's not religion. It frees you. It frees me. We're free to walk away from the burden of trying to impress God or something like we could. To try to live up to some standard that is perfection, really is what it is. It frees us from that burden of trying to please God all the time with our lives and what we do and what we say. That's what grace does. But more importantly, this is what grace does. More importantly, it frees us to extend grace to other people, even if they're soaking wet. That's the real Jesus. That's who he is. Grace isn't a part of Jesus. Grace is Jesus. Jesus is grace. He's extending grace to you right now. I don't know if you feel it right now, but his arms are out right now, and he's extending you grace even right now in this moment. My question is, will you receive that this morning? Will you take that this morning? Maybe some of you, for the very first time, need to cry out and say, I need your grace. I'm tired of religion. I'm tired of performing. And I need your grace. And I encourage you this morning during our response time between you and God and in the quiet of your own heart, say, Jesus, I just need your grace. That's it. I'm crying to you, Jesus. I need your grace. Would you forgive me and let me take your grace? Will you receive that this morning? Maybe for others in this room, you just need a fresh dose of it. Amen? You just need a fresh dose of Spirit. Just fall on me again. Just cover me again like you did yesterday, like you did last week, whenever it was. Sometimes we just need that fresh dose of grace. I want to allow some space here. I'm going to be very careful, okay? I want to allow some space here in the next few minutes for individuals in this room that might be soaking wet. I'm not going to call you out. I'm not going to embarrass nobody. Nothing like that. I just want to give you space to go before your Creator and accept grace. Okay, I know what it feels like. I've been there. I know what it feels like to screw up my life and then walk back into church and go, gosh, I hope, Jesus, you'll accept me again. Gosh, I hope that I won't be judged. I hope that I won't be ridiculed. I hope that no one will notice that I'm a screw up and that I messed up my life. And I just want to fit right back in the fall. I don't want nobody to know about it. I've been there. I've been there. And let me just tell you, friends, if that's you this morning and you're wet, this is the place to be wet, amen? 3D, come on. We want to welcome you. If you're wet, you are welcome to be in this place. You are welcome to worship wet. Come on, 3D. Let's go. You're welcome. Come on. You're welcome. Here's a towel. Here's a towel. You are welcome to worship wet in this place anytime. We're wet too. We're all wet. We're all broken. We all need grace. We all need Jesus. You're welcome here. And if you are in this place too, and maybe you have stepped into a little bit of a religion of your own, and maybe there's a little piece in you that needs to just be released. I need to let this go. I need to let some people back in the boat. Maybe not literally, but emotionally. Maybe if that's you, I want to give you that time too. So as they play, as we finish off, I'm going to ask some of our prayer team to go on back. I'm going to ask Pastor Keith to go back. I'll go up back. Ladies, if there's prayer warriors in here, ladies, go on. It's uncomfortable sometimes if you're a woman to pray with a man. Ladies, please go back there. We want to extend this time for you to just pray. For you to just say, I'm wet and I need prayer, or I've been religious and I need prayer and I need to let it go. That's what this time is all about. So I'm going to pray. I'm going to let these guys lead, and then we're just going to respond to what Jesus is doing. So Jesus, we are so thankful, God, for your grace. God, we are so thankful that you allow us to worship wet when we've screwed up and we've messed up and we've done things that we shouldn't have done. Jesus, you let us back in the boat. And you allow us to worship wet. God, if there is an ounce in me that's religious, that's religion, Jesus, would you strip that from me? Would you take that from me? Lord, would you take that from us? Let people know, let them see that there's no religion in us. It's all you, Jesus. It's been you, it always will be you, and it's you right now, Jesus. We pray that you would just go out before us. And we allow your Spirit to lead, Lord, in the name of Jesus, amen.